Good afternoon, everyone. I am just going to give a minute or two for some additional folks to jump onto the webinar, and we will start very shortly. Thanks for your attention. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining today. My name is Alexander von Rosenbach, and I am the interim director here at the International Center for Counter-Terrorism. I am very excited today to welcome you to this event. It is something we've been looking forward to for quite some time, and that is the launch of the Handbook on Terrorism Prevention and Preparedness. That handbook is, as I hope many of you know, edited by Professor Emeritus Alex P. Schmidt. And it is my great pleasure to have him join us today to both present and co-facilitate what I hope will be quite an engaging question and answer over the course of this afternoon. And I will hand the floor to him quite shortly, but first I wanted to just make a small introduction to ICCT. For those who don't know, ICCT was founded 10 years ago on a single conviction, and that is that we believe long-term security is best achieved through counterterrorism policy and counterterrorism practice that respects the rule of law and human rights. We also take pride in working at the leading edge of that field, and we do so certainly not on our own, but in concert with a wide array of partners around the world. And that sometimes to me sounds a bit abstract, so I want to just give you a minute here in terms of making that concrete. I think we work really at the global level, at the national level, and at the local level to make that happen, to find impact. At the global level, we work to shape approaches to counterterrorism. So we work closely with the Global Counterterrorism Forum, with the United Nations, with the European Commission, and many other global actors to help shape the norms and behaviors that we want to see in the world. For example, most recently, our experts have developed the Glion Memorandum on the use of rule of law-based administrative measures in counterterrorism. At the national level, we both advise and we implement. So for example, in the European context, we provide a lot of policy advice and briefings on the challenges and sensitivities of returning foreign terrorist fighters and their families, how to deal with them, and similar. In other contexts, we do a lot of work in the prison environment, helping shape national prison policies related to violent extremist offenders, and as well doing risk assessment work in, for example, prisons in Mali or Pakistan or Indonesia or further afield. But importantly, we also work at the local level, really shoulder to shoulder with law enforcement, with civil society actors, with judges and prosecutors. And we do so really to strengthen social resilience, to empower the victims of terrorism, and to build capacities to prevent and counter violent extremism. And I think it's important to note that we do this with a fundamental approach that is focused on evidence base. And that means we, as experts ourselves, contribute to the discourse. We generate research papers and the like, but we also use the ICCT journal to attract contributions from around the world and to make that research and that knowledge freely accessible to the public. And that is, I think, an important connection with the work we are going to discuss today, in that the ICCT journal is really center stage and has been for the last few days, in part because of our week-long 10-year anniversary celebrations, which this event today concludes. Last week, we had the journal release a number of publications looking forward at the future of counterterrorism. We also released a new interactive game called Flashpoints, where we put you in the seat of counterterrorism practitioners and ask you to make difficult choices about how to deal with an attack and the aftermath. But today, the journal is really the vehicle to help deliver what is an impressive piece of work, and one we are very pleased to release, and that is the Handbook. Before we go further, I just want to make a short note on logistics. So we have a full 90 minutes today, and I hope you'll be able to join us for the full session. About half of that will be presentations from some of the contributing authors, and half of it, we hope, will be a lively Q&A from all of those in the audience here today. So please do use the Q&A function that Zoom has to submit questions. We will try to deal with as many as we can through the course of this conversation. It's important to note also that this is the launch day for the handbook itself, at least for chapters, the part 1 of the book. And we will share a link in this session, as well as email you a link to the page where we are hosting all of the excellent contributions. So you should look for that through this session. But it's important to note that indeed we are only launching part 1 today, because we think it's really important to focus on different components of the briefing, of the handbook very carefully. So we have a plan to release a new chapter every week over the course of the winter and the fall, and also the winter and the spring, excuse me, and also to do more events like this. We bring the contributors together to really discuss some of the key themes. If you are interested in following along, getting information about the handbook, and getting invitations to subsequent events, please sign up if you haven't already done so, and we will make sure you're in the loop. Now, I will lastly spend a couple minutes introducing our speakers for today. And of course, I will start with Professor Schmidt. In my view, and I think in the view of many of those who work and study in the field of counterterrorism, Professor Schmidt needs no introduction, but I will give him a short one nonetheless. He is really a giant in the field of terrorism scholarship. He has been at the forefront of not only academic research, but also real policy work, real practitioner work for his entire life. He has over 200 publications to his name, not least of which is, of course, the seminal Handbook on Terrorism, which has really formed the bedrock for basically an entire generation of counterterrorism and terrorism experts. We are privileged at ICCT to have him as a longtime scholar and research fellow with us. And that's why we are super pleased that we can host today's publication and we can continue to support the handbook throughout what we expect to be quite a long life. We know that the research that the people that you see on the screen today have contributed, and others, is going to be relevant for a long time to come. And we're really excited to be partnered with all of them. So that is Professor Schmidt. I also want to note, of course, that we are joined by a number of other important contributors today. Firstly, I will spotlight Dr. Andreas Schadl, who is a researcher at the Berghoff Foundation. Prior to joining Berghoff, Andreas worked as a postdoctoral and PhD student in the Chair for International Conflict Research at ETH Zurich in Switzerland, where he studied the effectiveness of power sharing arrangements in conflict studies, particularly in ethnic conflicts. Previously, he also worked in disarmament section at the Swiss mission to the UN in Geneva and in various positions in the academic and financial sector. We are also joined, of course, by Rob de Wijk, who is the founder of the Hague Center for Security, the Hague Center for Strategic Studies, or HCSS, here in The Hague. He's also a professor of international relations and security at the Faculty of Governance and Global Affairs at Leiden University. Rob started his career in 1977 as a freelance journalist and later became the head of the Defense Concepts Department of the Ministry of Defense here in the Netherlands. He's also been the head of the Security Studies Unit at the Klingendahl Institute and a professor of international relations at the Royal Netherlands Military Academy. He's written extensively on security, including monographs, The Art of Military Coercion, and the book Power Politics. Lastly, and certainly not least, I'm pleased to be joined by Clark Macaulay, who is a professor emeritus of psychology at Bryn Mawr College and is also a lead investigator at the National Consortium for the Study of Terrorism and Responses to Terrorism. He's also a founding editor of the journal Dynamics of Asymmetric Conflict, Pathways Towards Terrorism and Genocide. And he has co-authored many, many different titles in the field, amongst others, Radicalization to Terrorism, also The Marvel of Martyrdom, and lastly, Why Not Kill Them All? The Logic of Prevention of Mass Political Murder. I will leave it there. I think you'll hopefully hear from me and the others in due course. But for now, Professor Schmidt, I'd love to hand over to you. Thanks. We are searching for Professor Schmidt. I have seen him earlier in the day, just a few minutes ago. So maybe we just can see if we can unmute him and release his video. Success, I see. And we're almost on video, and audio should come in a second. Thanks for bearing with us. Just the pleasures of the modern age. I'm afraid, Professor Schmidt, you're still on mute. Okay. There we go. I hear you. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. Well, good afternoon, everybody here in the Netherlands. Good morning, those in America, like Clark Macaulay, and good evening, those in the East. I'm very pleased with the first 6 chapters being released of this handbook. And in my introduction, I would like to give you some background. When I started work in this area as officer in charge of the Terrorism Prevention Branch, when it was just founded in 1999, there was no literature on prevention. And so I wanted to write such a handbook, pulling everything together. But I had neither the mandate from the member states of the UN, nor the money, and certainly not the time, because at that time, the UN had only 2 units dealing with terrorism. One was in New York and the other in Vienna. Now it has 40 different parts of the UN that deal with terrorism. So it has become, next to development, human rights and peace, almost the 4th pillar in the work of the UN. This has changed very much in the last 20 years. If you go look at the literature on the terrorism prevention, you will find it in the bibliography with which Ishan Singh has compiled for this volume. It's 130 plus pages. But much of that is, I'm afraid, quite superficial. There are very few monographs. They're more on prevention of extremism than prevention of terrorism. And extremism, terrorism, and radicalism have some overlap, but they are not quite the same. So in all these years after I left the UN, I hoped that somebody else would do the work, because it's not easy work. It's not very thankful work, especially if you have no grant to do it. But as nobody did it, I felt compelled to do it myself. And when I stopped teaching 2 years ago, I finally had the time to do it. So that was one rationale. But there was another one. I felt increasingly angered and sad by what became out of counterterrorism in the last 20 years. The so-called global war on terror has become as threatening as terrorism itself in some quarters. Remember 9/11, some 3,000 innocent people died. But what fewer people realize is that 100 times that many civilians died in the so-called 9/11 wars. There are altogether more than 800,000 people who got killed in these wars, in addition to the terrorists themselves. And if you look at this whole campaign of terrorism or counterterrorism, it has become in many ways counterproductive. And this forced me to look at some other ways than using brute force, because what has happened at 9/11, there were about 400 jihadists with Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan. Now Al-Qaeda has 30 to 40,000 members. There are altogether 120 jihadist movements and 150 non-jihadist movements in the field of terrorism. So in many ways, the way we fought terrorism has not been a good one. So I was looking for alternatives, and one alternative is look at prevention. But prevention is not easy. It was Benjamin Franklin, the polymath, who later also became US ambassador to France, who said an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. When he made his statement, he referred to medicine. And of course, that is in this COVID period on top of all our mind. But actually, there was something more urgent at that time. And that was that Philadelphia was a city that consisted largely of houses of wood. And he devised two things. One in 1736, namely a voluntary friar brigade for the city. Everybody who participated in this mutual assistance unit had to provide leather buckets. But more importantly, he also came up with something that was important for prevention rather than preparedness. Namely, in 1752, he invented the lightning rod that you put on your roof. At that time, it was not from copper, but from iron. And when a tempest came, the lightning would not go and put your wooden house aflame, but would deflect it into the ground. So when we turn to terrorism, we have to ask ourselves, what is the ounce of prevention? It's a bit like advertisement. Somebody said 80% of advertisement money is thrown out of the window, but we don't know which 80%. So when you look at terrorism, I just put up two scenarios. One we had recently in Vienna. How can you prevent these attacks where only a knife or a car is needed to kill random people, strangers to the terrorists themselves, or when plots are made in one country, executed in a second, and targeted in a third? It looks like mission impossible, but in fact, it isn't. Many acts of terrorism are prevented by vigilant citizens, by intelligence services. But all that knowledge that's out there has to be put together, pulled together, and that is what I tried to do in this volume. It was not easy because there are about 250 60 definitions of terrorism, and which of these terrorisms do you want to prevent? There are about 10 different types of terrorism, from cyber terrorism to religious terrorism. And then what is prevention itself? Can I have the next slide, please, Antoinette? Yeah, this is just, not only are there 260 definitions of terrorism, there are also more than 50 alleged causes. When I was, after 9/11, sitting in the General Assembly of the United Nations, listening to 172 speeches, everybody almost came up with a different explanation. People from developing countries stressed poverty, others stressed other reasons. So if there is a cause and effect relationship between terrorism and its prevention, it's important to know which of these factors are risk factors, are contributing factors, and which not. So all these things I had to struggle with. What I had to less struggle with was with finding definition of prevention that is less controversial. And there is also one for preparedness that's also less controversial. When I had these, I presented them to colleagues and friends, more than 36 of them. And you find them in the first 2 chapters of the handbook. And I invited them, giving them 36 topics to reflect on that, on prevention of radicalization, prevention of CBRN, terrorism, and so on. And we struggled with these subjects, and we worked on that. I also presented them with a simple typology of prevention, upstream, midstream, and downstream prevention, so that we had a common ground. Of course, it's more than I could hope for that all of them would strictly adhere to this framework, but I presented them and hoped that it was useful for them, and some of them adhered to it more closely than the other. Now, the way I started was, we have to harvest the knowledge that's out there. I had been in crime prevention at the UN, and I remember in 2005, we also celebrated not the 10th anniversary, but the 50th anniversary of the UN Crime Congresses, 50 years of crime prevention. And people joked, well, we still have crime after all your work of 50 years. But there's a lot of important knowledge out in crime prevention that can be used for the political crime of terrorism. The same is true for the literature on war, especially insurgent wars, guerrilla wars, counter-insurgency. That I thought could also offer something important. And I remembered Rob de Wijk, who would deal with these things in his books and before in his work at the Ministry of Defense. Actually, he asked us in the 1990s to develop a number of scenarios about post-Cold War wars. And I remember my colleague Bertha Youngman and I came up with half a dozen. And strange enough, 2 of these, the one in Nagorno-Karabakh and the one in Kosovo, did actually occur, though in a slightly different forms. Another field I had been working in while I was working at PIOM, a human rights organization that looked at gross human rights violations, mainly by states, was the field of genocide. And I knew Clark Macaulay had created a journal on asymmetric conflicts. And it always amazed me that the prevention of terrorism and the prevention of genocide were 2 different fields. In both cases, after all, innocent people are murdered by armed people unexpectedly and out of the blue. So I asked him to look how this field could come up with findings that were also applicable to terrorism. So for each of these related fields, conflict prevention, crime prevention, politicide prevention, I asked colleagues with whom I've worked for long in the field to pull that together. And the same is true for the other parts of the handbook, which we will address in a webinar that will be held when the other chapters of part 2 are finished. Well, I leave it with this short introduction, and now I pass on to the other speakers. But since Kelly Burkle could not be here with us, she's in New York at the John Jay College, I said I would say a couple of words of what she came up. She was finding that the field of situational crime prevention was something that was potentially applicable to terrorism prevention. Situational crime prevention doesn't look at the ideology of a perpetrator like radicalization studies do. They look at the circumstances, the hotspots where terrorism occurs and how you can harden these. Perhaps, Antoinette, you can give us the next PowerPoint that shows us what is at the core of situational crime prevention as developed in the book Smarty Answers to Terrorism by Ronald Clark and Graham Newton. And it gives you an idea that what can be done with these things, and certainly things like target hardening of airfields and so go down back to that type of literature. Antoinette, could I have the next slide? This model of situational crime prevention in outsmarting the terrorists has been further developed by Tore Bjørgo from Norway. He happened to be a former student of mine, a PhD student at Leiden University, and is now heading a prominent institute on countering right-wing extremism. But he looked at it even broader than situational crime prevention and added a number of other strands of criminological thought that he found, and came up with a sophisticated model of terrorism prevention. So in this sense, each field, crime prevention, conflict prevention, insurgency, countering, can offer bits, elements that can be used for terrorism prevention. And it is my hope that when all the 35 chapters are on the table, that we have a standard work that pulls together the current knowledge in the field, so we can produce a more sophisticated way of countering terrorism than the militarized response. This is not to deny that I did give a certain role to the military. Actually, in 1970, I was myself drafted to the military for the protection of an airfield after a number of terrorist attacks. So that has its place, but it shouldn't be the dominant approach. So with these few words of introduction, I'll pass the torch over to Andreas Schädel, who will speak both for himself and for Professor Giesmann. Professor Giesmann is himself involved actively in peacemaking with terrorists, which in the eyes of many one should not do, not shaking hands with terrorists. But if you look how terrorist campaigns came to an end, they rarely came to an end by military victory, but they came to an end by often back channel negotiations. Andreas Schädel will give us more on that. I pass it over to him.
So the first question would be, can you all hear and see me? Yeah. Okay. Then I'm still waiting for the slides. Okay, the slides are here. Okay, thank you very much for the kind introduction, Professor Schmidt and Alexander von Rosenbach. And good afternoon to everyone from Berlin. I very much hope that everybody who's watching is well. And I have to say it's a privilege and a pleasure to be here with you and to be able to present our chapter that explores a little bit how approaches and concepts and instruments from conflict prevention and conflict resolution practice and also related disciplines can be of use in conflicts that are marked by terrorist violence. Let me also use this opportunity briefly to, we can stay on the first slide, thank you, to congratulate you, Mr. Professor Schmidt and the ICCT for the enormous effort in putting together this massive handbook and also for organizing this event. It's very much appreciated. As you said, my name is Andreas Schädel. I'm a conflict researcher and an advisor for monitoring and evaluation at the Berger Foundation, which is an NGO in the field of conflict transformation and peace building. And we provide mediation and dialogue and negotiation support in peace processes. And before I start, I would also like to convey the best wishes of my colleague or my former supervisor and the co-author of this chapter, Professor Hans-Joachim Giesmann, who unfortunately cannot be here tonight. As you said, Professor Schmidt is actively and extensively involved in our support for the Afghan peace process. So what do we do in our chapter? We draw from the conflict resolution literature and from related disciplines, conflict prevention, conflict management, conflict transformation, peace building. And we examine how instruments of strategic negotiations and also transformative dialogue, which are both like central components in almost all these disciplines, how they can be of a valuable addition to terrorism prevention. We combine these two approaches under the header of talking, which is not really an academic concept, but it combines a lot of the approaches that are inherent to the field of conflict resolution and conflict prevention. So before I continue, I want to bring up a brief disclaimer or a conceptual bias in our approach. In our chapter, we build heavily on the predominant literature on terrorism, and we look at the phenomenon mostly from the perspective of governments. So we treat terrorism as a non-state phenomenon and conflict between a legitimate state actor on the one side and an illegitimate power contender on the other side. However, throughout the chapter, we repeatedly challenge this simplistic view of terrorism, as it tends to throw all forms of armed resistance into one basket of illegitimate action, even if that action is rooted in grievances of a larger social, ethnic, or religious group, or if that group engages in resistance against oppression or autocracy. So now to the next slide, please. Thank you very much. If we can go back to Afghanistan, because I mentioned it before, I think it's a good way to start or to continue this presentation. Here we see the signing of a historic agreement, which happened earlier this year between the US and the Taliban after 19 years of war, or many more years, but 19 years with the involvement of the US. And what's so striking about this agreement is not so much its provisions, but the fact that these talks happened in the first place. Because, and if we can go to the next slide, please. The deal with the Taliban stands in very stark contrast to the categorical refusal of US administrations and frankly, most other political leaders to use anything else but force in the interaction with terrorist groups. So we see here quotes from a number of high-level representatives of several US administrations. And what these quotes illustrate is that no matter which administration is in power, there is and has been a categorical refusal to negotiate with terrorists. And this refusal, if we can go to the next slide, is based on a number of arguments, which we discuss in detail in the chapter. But unfortunately, we don't have the time to go into too much detail here in this presentation. But we make it very clear, or maybe just to mention a few, probably the most common argument is the assumption that, that talking to terrorists inspires more terrorism. Another argument would be that by involving terrorist groups in a negotiation or a dialogue, this would give them publicity and would also elevate them to the status of a legitimate representative of a constituency or a territory. Or another prominent argument against talking with terrorists is that they are irrational psychopaths, and it's not only immoral and unethical to talk to them, but also pointless. We make it very clear in our chapter that there's a lot of validity in these arguments. However, at the same time, these arguments often do not hold when examined in more detail. They're either not supported by empirical evidence, or they rely on flawed understandings of key concepts, such as legitimacy. So in the chapter, we deconstruct them in detail, and I can only invite you to read it for those of you who are interested. If we can go to the next slide, please. Oh no, I think we have to skip this one and come back later. Yes, exactly. So the arguments I've just mentioned before, these are the arguments that have prevented many governments throughout the 20th century from engaging in talks with terrorist groups. We have time and again seen how governments escalate repression and violence and categorically rule out talks with an opponent that they labeled terrorists, only then to realize later that sometimes after many years of a bloody war, that negotiations would have been the only way out. And to some extent, I think this is also what happened in Afghanistan, or what's currently happening in Afghanistan. Other examples that are listed here on the slide are, for example, the British war against the IRA in the Irish War of Independence, and also later in Northern Ireland. They're dealing with the uprising, the Palestinian uprising, the Mau Mau uprising in Kenya, where the British government heavily escalated repressive violence, and only when this strategy then proved unsuccessful, they withdrew and started negotiations. And the same happened to the French government in the war in Algeria, where after more than 5 years of a bloody war against Algerian nationalists, they realized that there was no military solution to the conflict, which then ended in a negotiated agreement that ultimately also led to the independence of Algeria. So now I think we can go back quickly to the former. Exactly, thank you. But of course, governments cannot prevent or effectively deal with terrorism just by talking. I mean, an effective strategy also requires firm security policies, effective intelligence, and in some cases, of course, hard military power. Ultimately, however, there are often no viable alternatives to entering talks. And there is also strong empirical evidence in support of this claim. There is this much quoted study by Jones and Libicki, who look at over 650 terrorist groups and how they ended, and they found that 43% of them ended in a transition to a political process, while only 7% ended due to or as a result of a military defeat. And their results are also supported by another study, Cronin 2009, who look at several ways of how terrorist groups could end. And she comes to the same conclusion and finds that negotiations are the most likely way for terrorist groups to end, and also, or maybe then also transition into a political process. There are a number of methodological issues with both studies, but overall they show clearly that military defeat of terrorist groups is relatively rare. But of course, that's not to say that talking to terrorists is not difficult or morally hazardous, but in cases where the terrorist movement enjoys significant political support and the conflict parties are interested in exploring political solution, it has indeed proven to be the right thing to do and the most promising way to end violence and also save lives. And if we can skip the next slide and go, exactly, thank you. Okay, and all of what I've just said is obviously also in the chapter, but it's just the first half of the chapter. And it sets sort of the stage for the second part of the chapter, which then looks at how such talks would, with terrorists would eventually or actually look like. For example, we look at the process of negotiations with terrorist groups from the very beginning when government representatives make first personal contact with the terrorist leadership and establish informal communication channels with the aim of developing working trust in one another, to then the breakthrough from back channels to official negotiations, to then actual negotiations, and we also look at how such negotiations should be designed, and then how an eventual agreement could look like and how it is implemented. Then we also look in detail into the role of trust, which is a central requirement in such processes, both as a precondition to enter talks, but also as the objective of talks and negotiations. So trust is needed to enter negotiations, but negotiations can also help the parties to build trust in one another. We also look at the role of timing. Talking may be the right thing to do, but it's not always the right time to do so. So for this purpose, we introduced the concept of the mutually hurting stalemate, so as sort of a push factor that makes parties realize that their aims are not attainable by further violence, but better achieved through alternative lines of action. And then we also look at terrorist spoilers, that want to derail the peace process, and at ways to prevent such spoiling. And then finally, the chapter concludes by looking beyond classical approaches of conflict resolution and provides a first glimpse of a systemic conflict transformation approach that does not only attempt to bring an end to or reduce terrorist and counter-terrorist violence, but also aims to transform the underlying structural violence and oppression that often form sort of the context in which terrorist violence occurs. And with that, I thank you for your attention, and I give the floor back to Professor Schmidt, or to Clark McCauley, I think, who's the next speaker. Thank you very much.
Shall I just get started?
Yeah, please, Rob. Absolutely.
All right. Okay. Thank you. Thank you so much. Well, thank you very much. Hello, everyone, wherever you are. This is Rob de Wijk from the Netherlands. I'm in The Hague right now in my study, and I would like to say a few words on my chapter, which is on the contributions from the military counter-insurgency literature for the prevention of terrorism. I think that there are some important lessons to be learned if you read the doctrines, but also the studies on counterinsurgency. I wouldn't myself call a practitioner, but I've seen a lot. For example, in Afghanistan, I've been dealing with special operation forces for quite a long time. And I look what happened in those places, and I linked it to the doctrinal developments, which went on for quite a number of decades, which are actually rooted in our colonial time. Already in those days, we had to deal with terrorist and insurgents, although we will call them differently, of course, now. But nevertheless, it provides some important lessons learned also for modern military operations. Now, military establishments have learned that insurgents and terrorists are part of a broader political struggle. And I think that is very important to remember. It's not something that takes place in isolation. The population is indeed the center of gravity. For that reason, because it is populace-centric, some important lessons can be drawn. For the military, the key difference between counterinsurgency and counter-terrorist operations is that insurgents rely on the support of the populations, while terrorists are individuals or isolated groups or cells without broad public support. There is, of course, a gray zone here, that's for sure, but conceptually in their doctrines, the military make this distinction. The difference is that counterinsurgency operations require hearts and minds campaigns, while counterterrorism requires search and arrest operations in order to destroy the adversary. What should be done, of course, is avoid to cause too much damage and too much trouble for the population. In my view, counterterrorism should also go hand in hand with a hearts and mind campaign. This is true for example, Afghanistan, and this is a hard lesson learned in Afghanistan, but it is also true for domestic counter-terrorism, terrorist operations. For example, in my country, the Netherlands, if you lose the support of the population, then you are lost in general. So I consider this as a prerequisite for gaining the support of the population. Hearts and mind campaign is extremely important. If you don't do that, you cannot prevail in the political struggle. Now, this of course requires responsible leaders, and I think this is the major problem here. In the previous presentation, spoilers were mentioned. You have spoilers in international operation, but you also have domestic spoilers. And this is, in my view, a great risk, which cannot contribute and will derail the whole peace process. So what you need is leaders that abstain from harsh rhetoric, stigmatization of sectors of the society vulnerable to terrorist appeals, and refraining to contribute to polarization between majority and minority group in society. That is, in my view, very important. Political leaders ought to respect groups, identities and grievances, and should take socio-economic measures to take away some of those grievances. At the same time, they should be aware of, for example, the jihadists or other militants will try to deprive the population from a sense of security, as most insurgents and terrorists will make a cost-benefit calculus, and that's quite interesting, and that's a very important lesson learned of counterinsurgency operations. Terrorist insurgents can be deterred up to a certain level, of course. You never can have 100% assurance that someone can be deterred, but deterrence can be effective and can be possible. So thus the increased cost of action by the deterring side is important. It's always a cost-benefit calculus. One of the lessons learned is indeed that deterrence can be effective. And the reason is that most terrorists are, and the same also of course for insurgents, are rational actors, and they make a rational cost-benefit calculus. Now, deterrence theory, and this is a military theory, makes a distinction between two forms of deterrence. The first one is deterrence by denial, and this involves denying a group or a terrorist from achieving its political objectives. And then the other one is deterrence by punishment, which involves the partial destruction of a group or individuals. Well, deterrence by denial could take different forms. Some examples are the hardening of potential targets. And what we've seen over the last decades is a shift away from attacking American embassies. And this is, of course, related to the hardening of the target. But you can also upgrade border controls, or you can reinforce cockpit doors in passenger aircraft. You can tighten border control, the outer borders of the European Union. These are simple, relatively simple and effective means to deter terrorists from attacking objectives. Of course, they will find other ways to achieve their objectives, but at least you can prevent major attacks, and that is something, in my view, that is happening already, because most of the attacks are carried out with a knife. What you also see, for example, is following the attacks on Christmas markets in Europe and other public events, roadblocks or even walls have been introduced to deter attacks with trucks. Restricting access to facilities needed for the manufacturing of, for example, biological, chemical, and radiological weapons explain the limited number of attempts to carry out those attacks. That's also a very interesting issue here. Active countermeasures can also be effective, but this is really a military measure. And then I'm thinking, for example, of Israel's Iron Dome missile defense system, which is designed to counter missile attacks. Now, statistical data show that deterrence can be effective. Before carrying out an attack, terrorists will, of course, make an assessment, and the same also for insurgents. They will make an assessment of the likelihood of success. They will probably shift from hard targets to soft targets, and if that is impossible with heavy equipment, they will do it with knives. And I already said that. Now, deterrence by punishment is much more difficult. And it is usually directed against targets that are of great value for terrorists. For example, and this is an important one, attacks on the adversaries' command, control, and communication systems, and of course their intelligence systems, and this is also a military concept, could affect the group's individual motivation. And not only that, but it could also loosen control over a group who is supposed to carry out the operation. So attacking C3, command, control, communications, will introduce uncertainty. And it is something that is done, for example, in Afghanistan when attacking the Taliban. This is part of the counter-insurgency, counter-terrorism mission in a country like Afghanistan. What is also possible then is that C3 attacks, command, control, communication attacks, and eavesdropping could deter terrorist leaders from using, for example, cell phones, satellite communications, and computers. And also this deprives them of a way to command the whole operation. Much more difficult is the targeting of leaders. Leadership targeting is extremely difficult, but it could be interesting to compel the adversary to refrain from offering assistance to terrorists. This worked quite well in the Middle East with Hezbollah and Fatah, which were dependent on Iran, Lebanon, and the Palestinian Authority and Syria. But on the other hand, as we have seen with the leadership targeting in Afghanistan, the killing of Osama bin Laden, the terrorist organization just changed the way, just changed its modus operandi, and it continues to exist until today. And this, I have to say, was already taken into account when we had the discussion. I was a little bit involved in those discussions in Afghanistan, what to do with Al-Qaeda after, and what would happen with Al-Qaeda after the end of Osama bin Laden. Targeted killing and the killing of bin Laden is targeted killing, is an extreme form of deterrence by punishment, of course. And the same holds true for the destruction of terrorist facilities. The idea is that it can diminish the individual motivations or influence group behavior, but this is a tricky issue. I really do not believe in it, because if you do it wrong, then it will indeed motivate the opponent. Since deterrence by punishment is likely to have an effect on the population, it carries with it the same disadvantage as the counter-insurgency operations, which are carried out with brute force. Brute force is usually something that doesn't work. So we have to be very, very careful with that. That is also an important lesson to be learned. It can have detrimental effects, and it can just have the opposite effect you want. For that reason, an interesting new form of is deterrence by delegitimation. This is a form of deterrence that seeks to raise the cost of participating in terrorism by challenging its normative, religious, and social political rationales. It's an important way of dealing with terrorists, but it requires, of course, a new narrative, and it requires cooperation with the group in which terrorists or insurgents are embedded. And that is a major problem, because that is not easy. And here, this can only be done if it goes hand in hand with a Hearts and Mind campaign. In sum, military establishments have learned that insurgency and terrorism are part of a broader political struggle. That is something that is not generally understood in our domestic political establishment, because this required restraint. And this is something that most politicians, or many politicians, not most, simply do not want. The population is the center of gravity. So every measure you take should take into account what the consequences for the population is and how they will behave. Now, nowadays we have completely new ideas also, which is not included in the paper, on how to influence the population with behavioral dynamics. This is completely new, and we're now thinking about this, but we have a long way to go before we reach a stage where it can be effective. So protecting the population, dealing with the population, is a key to success to any counterinsurgency, and in my view also counter-terrorist campaign. Hearts and Mind campaigns are crucial. This should not be confused with softness, and this is something sometimes done in our homelands. Politicians say, well, that is soft. You drink tea with terrorists or with groups. You shouldn't do that. This is a wrong approach in my view. This is also a hard lesson learned by the military during counterinsurgency operations. It is essential. It's an essential activity to prevail in a political struggle. It requires responsible leaders to abstain from harsh rhetoric, stigmatization of sectors of society. And that is something we really have to learn. And that is also something very important you can learn from the counterinsurgency doctrines and experiences of military establishments. I would like to leave it here. Thank you very much.
I see Professor Schmidt speaking, but I don't hear him.
Clark, I think you can start. I assume Professor Schmidt is handing over to you, but I think the floor is definitely yours.
Okay. Hello, everybody. I'm Clark McCauley. I'm in the state of Wyoming in the mountains in the US of A. And very pleased to have this chance to participate in the launch of the handbook. I guess I'd like the first slide if I could see that. I'm going to try to hurry along here because I know that there are going to be questions, and it'd be good to make room for some of those. Well, I'm not sure I can see the slides, but I'm talking about lessons from Politicide because genocide is too narrow. There are lots of mass killing, mass murder for political reasons that don't have anything to do with ethnicity. So I prefer to talk about politicide. The warrant for my chapter is, as already mentioned by Professor Schmidt, politicide and terrorism both aim to kill civilians, so it's possible to find some parallels between these that can maybe have some useful lessons. Next slide, please. Well, here's a couple examples of mass killing that doesn't easily fit under the heading of genocide. Next slide. I had a whole long list of things that I believe we've learned about politicide, of which the second is the most important, and it is the same as the lesson that previous speakers have been offering, which is that you can't understand politicide, you can't understand mass political murder without thinking of it as the outcome of intergroup conflict, a conflict that has a trajectory and a history over time, and it's that trajectory that has to be understood if you want to understand the mass political murder. And that same lesson obtains for understanding terrorists and terrorism. Terrorism is the outcome of one outcome of an intergroup conflict that extends over time, has a trajectory and a history. We can't understand terrorism without understanding that history and that trajectory. This kind of trajectory can be tracked with polling. So for instance, we know that in the US, there's about 30% of US Muslims who believe that the war on terrorism is a war on Islam. And there's about 10% of US Muslims who believe that suicide bombing against civilians in defense of Islam is often or sometimes justified. Now, it means a serious portion of American Muslims sympathize with the concerns, with the grievances that the terrorists propose to work against. And likewise for the right wing in the US, we can see that there's a theory abroad, this theory that of replacement, that white people are being replaced by darker skinned people. There's a fact at the bottom of that. A year or two ago, was the first time that less than half of the people in the US under the age of 16 were not white. And furthermore, we know from polls that there's like 20 to 40% of Americans in various states, state by state, 20 to 40% who are against immigration. So I mention these things to say that there's a sizable body of support and sympathy for both jihadist terrorism and right-wing terrorism in the US. And tracking this kind of mass sympathy is tracking the war of ideas. Next slide. So suppose you want to change this trajectory. Well, I think the current countering violent extremism programs are pretty much useless. They aim to suppress the grievances or show the negative side of the terrorists or the militants who claim these grievances. So we try to get jihad and Muslim victim videos off the internet. The Think Again, Turn Away program was to show the ugly side of ISIS. 2019 Facebook ban on white nationalist and white supremacist content. This is all suppression. So as far as I can see, at least in the US, countering violent extremism programs offer no defense of US foreign policy toward Muslim countries, offer no suggestion how to help blue-collar whites who fear status reversal and economic decline. And suppressing and ignoring their grievances isn't working. Next slide. So how could we do better? Well, one way is to recognize the grievances, at least as a starting point. Here's an idea that I ran into in studying UK programs to help parolees toward de-radicalization and disengagement. And they start off by basically agreeing. This is with regard to Islamic grievances. They agree that Muslims have real grievances. And they try to move from that to talking about what's best to be done to reduce victimization of Muslims. Is violence really the best answer? Is that the best chance of helping victimized Muslims? And they argue that the human and moral costs of violence and violence begetting more violence are arguments against violence. And so they're trying to convince their parolees not that there is no grievance, not even that the grievance justifies violence. You could say it does justify violence, but the question is violence the best thing you can do? And I think this is a very useful example of how to go about recognizing grievances in a countering violent extremism kind of a program. And perhaps something similar would be possible for right-wing grievances. And I'm going to wrap it up there. Thank you for your attention.
Super. Thank you very much, Clark, and for all the other speakers for their comments today. We have indeed run a little bit over the hour, but indeed, I hope that we can stay together for the next 25 minutes to work through some of the questions that have come in. Professor Schmidt, I wanted to give you a chance to pose any questions that are top of mind for you. You've obviously had long conversations with all of these authors. And I think there are quite some common themes. Did you want to launch in with any particular question, or shall we just start picking some out from the ones that are flooding in now? I'm afraid we need to unmute Mr. Professor Schmidt. Hold on. Perhaps we struggle with that. While we try and figure out how to unmute him, because we definitely want to release his intellect back into this conversation. I wanted to start with a question for Rob de Wijk, because I thought your article was really interesting, makes a really interesting comparison literature between COIN practices and the CT community. But my question is, obviously we have the international humanitarian law, which guides what armed forces can do in conflict. But in the domestic sphere, there's quite a different set of legal frameworks and judicial frameworks that apply, particularly around the protection of basic fundamental human rights and freedoms for citizens. So how much can we apply what is a bit more freewheeling structure in the international armed conflict space to a domestic environment in terms of the sort of rules of the road for playing there for military or police forces or others?
Well, that's a fair question, of course. You really must make a distinction between the legal issues and, let's say, the more conceptual issues. In my article, I focused on the conceptual issues, what works and what works not. For example, as I explained, when you carry out an counterinsurgency operation or a counter-terror operation, let's say in Afghanistan, then you have to take the population into account. It's an isolated operation, but it's embedded in the population, and everything you do could go at the expense of the population, and and the result is that it could turn the population against you. A notion like this is universal. that is something that applies also for domestic counter-terrorist operations. This is something, in my view, that is often forgotten by politicians. I talk about that behind the scenes many times in this country. Be careful what you do. Refrain from harsh rhetoric, because if you do that, you will create a situation where you create a kind of sanctuary for the insurgents, and that is, or for the terrorists in this case, and that is not very helpful. So in other words, you have to deal with the population. You always have to take the population into account, and that is something that is often forgotten. So this is not a legal issue, and of course there are legal issues. But remember that you cannot do in war everything you want. You must make a distinction between combatants and non-combatants. And if you kill non-combatants, you are in trouble, as we know very well in our countries. And this is more or less conceptually quite similar than what we do, for example, in this country, the Netherlands.
Thanks very much. I see we have professionals.
I had one
Go
word
ahead, please. Yeah, absolutely.
I'd like to say that it's both populations you have to pay attention to. In an intergroup conflict, the opinions and the emotions of both populations count. And so it's not just the terrorists and their population of support, it's the state and its population of support, and how both of those kinds of population change over time. That's what we have to pay attention to.
Thanks for that. Yeah, important clarification that it is indeed a two-way street here. I think that sort of the phrase you use in your article about political jiu-jitsu or jiu-jitsu politics is sort of speaks to that point, that you end up with a blow and counter blow cycle of violence if you don't take both parties into account. Professor Schmidt, sorry, your microphone is on, and I saw you speaking earlier, so I want to give you the chance to jump in.
Well, we all agree that the people matter, but actually there are two big black holes in international law. We have a definition of what a state is: territory plus a population, plus other states that recognize it, plus a government, but there is no definition of people in international law. And there is also no definition of nation in international law. So when we talk about self-determination or national liberation, the way nation or people are conceptualized are matters of controversy. We have to look at who has sympathy with terrorism, who gives support to terrorism, who sympathizes with their goals, who accepts the means. So what happens in a terrorist scenario is that you polarize the population. When you look at the explanations behind the 9/11 attacks, it was meant that the American reaction would punish or wake up the Muslim population in the world, and that a body of Muslims of more than 1 billion people would finally come out and rally behind the terrorists, which hasn't happened. In fact, there has been uprisings in the Arab world at 2011 to 2012, but they were not inspired by the terrorists. So the way the people react is important, but we have to distinguish between sectors. I think Lady Thatcher once said, she was also the one who called publicity the oxygen of terrorism. She also said there is no such thing as society. These are constructs, and we have to go and look down at the demographics and at shifting demographics, as Clark Macaulay has pointed out, to see where the center of gravity is and how it can shift. Back to you.
Sure, thanks. We have a question in around the role of restorative justice in the context of conflict resolution and involving communities, and the sort of importance of conversation and dialogue between victims and perpetrators. Andreas, did you want to speak to that a little bit, given your experience and the focus of your piece?
Well, if you talk about restorative justice and bringing victims of perpetrators together, you of course assume that the perpetrator recognizes that some injustice has been done. And then, and only then, the victim can try to forgive. But the concept of forgiveness as a one-sided operation of victims is really not working. And unfortunately, especially when you deal with terrorists who think their race or their religion is superior to all others, then you don't have a discussion of equals between victims and perpetrators. So as much as one would want a dialogue, I think the victim needs to be supported by the government in this discussion and cannot be left in an unequal discussion with perpetrators who have not regretted or restored anything. So there is only a limited role for restorative justice, and only after a peace has been achieved. It often takes half a generation for that.
Andreas, did you want to add anything to that?
Yes, please. Thank you. Maybe to add, Hartman, who I also mentioned in the chapter, he provides an excellent framework for negotiations with terrorist groups that go far beyond signing of an agreement and also the implementation of an agreement. And this framework includes also the establishment of mechanisms, relations, and institutions that manage the underlying conflicts so to prevent future eruptions of violence and build channels for future cooperation. And these can include constitutional reviews, but also a new political system, but also the strengthening of institutional reconciliation and transitional justice. And maybe to add also, research has also shown that peace processes are on average much more sustainable and more effective if they are inclusive and participatory. And this applies in particular to the inclusion of representatives of civil society, that is religious leaders, women organizations, youth groups, victim groups, which have shown to make a successful negotiation and also implementation of a peace process much more likely. And this applies also to non-state armed groups. And expanding inclusion in the direction of civil society also reduces sort of the incentive for the strategic use of spoiler violence or spoiling through other means during negotiations and also during implementation of an agreement, and has a very strong potential to limit post-agreement violence or the breakdown of an agreement.
Add something here. Am I online? There was an interesting form of collaboration after a peace agreement in Northern Ireland. I once went on a tour through the Protestant and the Catholic neighborhoods, and the bus was going through both sides, and the speakers, the guides, the tour guides changed. On the morning there was a loyalist tour guide, in the afternoon a Republican tour guide, and they both had a common enterprise in organizing these post-terrorist tours. But of course that's not a dialogue between victims and perpetrators, but between a spokesperson of former perpetrators. But it was one form of bridging the gap that had existed for almost 30 years in the Troubles. Back to you, Alexander. You have more questions?
We do, yeah. I have a question here around some of the role, and it was something I wanted to follow up on myself as well, regarding the example that was given by Clark Macaulay about the sort of UK success model that was referenced there. And the question that we got in was whether the strategies and the approaches that he's referencing as a positive example were part of the UK Prevent strategy more broadly, or whether those were, as the Prevent strategy has come under some criticism, I think, regarding how it engages with minority populations, or whether this was other initiatives that you were referring to. Did you want to give a bit more light on that one?
I believe that it is not an explicit part of the Prevent program. I believe it is what I call an initiative on the part of the parole officers who are responsible for trying to de-radicalize and disengage individuals who have been convicted of especially jihadist style offenses. So I think they found this because it worked, not because it was part of any explicit program.
Okay, yeah, interesting. I'm just getting a reminder, A, that there are 10 minutes left, and B, that I do want to note that we will share out a link in a second here to the actual formal launch of the handbook. So when you see something pop up in your chat, for those that are with us still, of which there are many, I see, please do come take a look at it. Obviously, these chapters are available for download there and have quite a rich depth of argumentation in them to build on all the points you're hearing today. I wanted to come back to, I think, a point that is raised multiple times throughout the each of your works, actually, in different ways, and that is being drawn on in a couple questions I see here about the sort of notion of engaging the underlying structural violence and oppression that occurs. That was made by Andreas. Similarly, the sort of objective of engagement or acknowledgement of grievances, it's this sort of notion that we need to do more to listen effectively and to really figure out what is structurally wrong before we start to do suppression methods, or perhaps alongside suppressive efforts. I think it's quite an interesting example, but you see that is oftentimes not what we are really able to do. When you look at what's happened in recent weeks in response to the attacks in France and then in Austria, we see mostly more suppressive tactics, more harsh rhetoric, taking down civil society institutions related to Islamic institutions or religious groups. We here in the Netherlands just the other day, released some statements about training of imams to sort of certify, and that's something that is being replicated in France and other areas. So we are trying to still working through this idea that we need to teach the right way to be a Muslim, and there is a sort of safe way to be a Muslim within our communities. That doesn't seem to me like a response that acknowledges the grievances. And I wanted to sort of get maybe starting with Clark, who's shaking his head, some response, but then maybe for those who want to pick up this thread to say, what do we feel about the sort of the current responses in the current climate? We had sort of a quiet period now, and we have through COVID, we now have quite an urgent question at top of mind. How do you feel about those issues that are being raised and the counter responses from the governments of the day?
Well, I think it's mostly suppression and denial is the heart and soul of the CVE program, at least in the US. I'm not so familiar with others in other countries. And I don't see how it's working. I mean, you can't have 30% of a population believe that the war on terrorism is a war on Islam and not have some ugly consequences come of that. And it just won't do to try to pretend that it's not true, or to pretend that there's nothing to it, or to pretend that we can just ignore and suppress these kinds of feelings. I mean, there's no attempt, as far as I can see, is any part of any CVE program in the US to make an argument about the advantages or the moral status of American foreign policy.
Andreas, I see you have your mic off, and also Professor Schmidt. I don't know which of the two of you wants to respond.
Originally, when countering violent extremism was introduced, this was supposed to be a less violent response than the military response, but it has deteriorated, and when the when the Trump administration came to power, they switched again and used prevent violent extremism, whereby prevention was often in terms of military strikes. We prevent terrorism at home by keeping the terrorists out by walls or by fighting them over there. But grievances, to come back to structural factors, the world is full of grievances and many of them are justified. The problem is that terrorism is, in most cases, not helpful to solve those grievances. It might be helpful sometimes for awareness raising, but it is also about burning bridges. But as Rob de Wijk said, in the Hearts and Minds operation, one has to address the concerns, including the grievances of critical sectors of the population. But there is also overabundance of things that are wrong in the world, and one cannot address them all. For instance, poverty is a huge problem and it's getting much worse, but poverty has very little to do with terrorism. Unemployment is a big problem. Unemployment has almost nothing to do with transnational terrorism, but it helps people to be recruited to terrorism. The situation in refugee camps, like in northern Kenya, where children have for 20 years seen nothing outside the camp. Of course, if somebody comes and offers them a Kalashnikov and a salary and smuggles him out of the camp, that is attractive. So the grievances in refugee camps, the grievances in Iraq and Syria in these camps are real, and many politicians do not want to address these, and the longer we wait, the more explosive the situation gets. So we have to deal with these things, but politically it's very difficult to go to these original grievances, which much larger sectors of the population have than the terrorists themselves. The terrorists only capitalize on these grievances.
I'd like to point out that even the word grievance very seldom appears in any of this CVE kinds of conversation. We like to talk about ideology, which nobody has a serious definition of that I can see, or narratives, which again can mean many things to many people. But the reason I believe that those kinds of conversations about ideology and narrative are attractive is that they both exist in the heads of them. See, them, the problem's out there. They got the bad ideas, the bad ideology. They got this destructive narrative. So it puts the problem in their heads, whereas even talking about a grievance implies that there's an interaction and somebody's doing something to somebody else, or at least somebody thinks somebody's doing something to somebody else. So I believe all the conversation we hear in the literature about ideology and narrative is just a good way to put off dealing with the fact that there are real grievances out there.
Yeah. So I'm going to try and wrap up the session by asking each of you then the same question, which is, what can we do about that? I think that's the common theme of all of your chapters here. I mean, there are many, but this is the one that we've been talking about the most. So recognizing we have a group, several hundred folks on the line who are sitting in a policy role, who are sitting somewhere trying to figure out how to grapple with this in a local community. 30 seconds from each of you to say, one thing, if you can speak to them and say, what can you do today or tomorrow to start dealing with this issue of grievances in a real and substantial way? What would it be from each of your perspectives? Clark, you've got the mic open, so I'll give you 30 seconds to think about that.
Pay attention to polls of the people who sympathize with or might sympathize with the terrorists.
Andreas, question to you.
Thank you. I think what we need is a more holistic or a systemic approach, and not only attempts to reduce or de-escalate terrorist or counter-terrorist violence, but also goes beyond that short or medium-term perspective and kind of reflects the complexity of systems and contributes to their kind of their transformation.
Okay, thanks. Rob, 30 seconds. What one thing for our folks out there?
Yeah.
Hard choice.
Think before you act. Understand what the concepts are, understand how it works. I think that is extremely important. If you don't understand, you just do something, and that's a recipe for disaster.
Sure. And Professor Schmidt, I'll leave that thought with you, the lasting final word here.
Well, we have to bring our words and our actions closer together. The whole discussion on terrorism reminds me a bit of a tennis game where a radio reporter reports only what's happening on one side of the court, on the terrorist side, but not on the counter-terrorist side. And unfortunately, much of counter-terrorism has been counterproductive and has made things worse rather than better. And reflecting more on how our deeds come over with the other side and then adapt it, I think is the first step towards more effective policies.
Yeah, I think the lesson there across the board is listen well, listen with whatever tools and means you have, polls or in direct engagement. But I think it's an important message to take forward. So thank you very much for this. I think we're going to try and leave it here. I firstly, of course, just want to say thank you to all those who joined to listen today, and who I hope will enjoy reading the articles that have been generated by these and the other contributors in quite some effort. And so please do take a moment to go to the website, check out, download, and read them, and give us some feedback also. We are keen to engage in debate here. For all those who spoke today, thank you very much for the participation. Yeah, I wanted to flag basically the last thing that, as I said at the beginning, this will be a recurring theme that we have for ICCT over the next month. So we will be releasing chapters every week. We will have more webinars that bring together different speakers. The next event we have planned will focus on chapter 2 of the handbook, which focuses on radicalization, the pathways to radicalization in prisons, in refugee camps, online, in communities and diasporas around the world. And we, I think, have some really fascinating insights there, moving really to the heart of how we get terrorists and in the world, the pathway that they pursue to become a violent actor in our communities. So please stay in touch with us on social media, on our newsletter to see what that looks like, and we'll look forward to inviting to that. And lastly, just before we end here, this event is a product of a lot of folks who I firstly want to give a hand to behind the scenes, editing and publishing the handbook. So I really wanted to give a thanks to those folks, and also to note that this event is also one of a series, and we want to make everyone better than the last. So give us some advice. There's a pop-up survey, just 2 questions. When you leave this webinar, let us know how we did here. Let us know what we can do to improve, and we'll bring that into the next seminars that we deliver. But thank you very much for your time, everyone, and have a good evening or a good morning where you are, and thanks for your attention. Good night.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.